Okay, so I'm going to show how I created my game for my final project. Because my concentration is specifically in math, I thought it would be interesting to create a scavenger hunt with multi-step equations. So this type of lesson or game would be used in a pre-algebra class for 7th or 8th grade, depending on when students are doing multi-step equations. So a lot of the different backdrops and sprites that I used for creating my game were a little bit more intricate when creating them, so I ended up copying just the sprites and the backdrops from my final game just to show the code of how I created my game. So I'm going to go through that. So starting off with the backdrops, which is usually where I like to start when I'm creating a game. I usually like to have some sort of cover page. In this case, it's multi-step scavenger hunt, and I added little footsteps because I thought it was kind of fun. My second backdrop that I created was the rules of my game. I ended up just doing it as a backdrop to make it a little bit easier to show the rules of the game instead of writing it on that side panel in the final projects page. So I use the text to write the directions to my game. Then for my level 1, I created just a green board just to make it simple so you can see the cards and the equations throughout the whole game. I labeled it here with level 1 so that both the player knows that they're on level 1, and that when I was coding that I knew that I was dealing with level 1. I did the same thing for level 2, so I just changed the number. I ended up duplicating it. This was one of the easier backdrops that I created. And then the last backdrop that I created, I thought it would be fun to have a little bit of balloons and like a winner, kind of like a celebration, like you won sort of backdrop. So I took the backdrop, which I'll show here. If I scroll down, there is, this is going to load, okay, here. So I took the party background and using the different features here, especially this reshaping tool, I deleted parts of the background just to take the balloons that you can see here. And I took a plain green background that I had for the rest of my other backdrop costumes and added winner. For my sprites, I have 3 buttons here that I use throughout my game. I have a start button, which I just took a button sprite that was already in the Scratch program and added the word start on it in the marker font, which is one of my favorites that I like to use. I did the same thing for the replay button as well as the how to play button. The cards that I have for the scavenger hunt game that I created were a little bit more complex in the costumes that they have with the code that goes along with it. So if we look at Sprite A here, it has the orange box around it. I started it with there because I was creating riddles in this game and you need a place to start. So I figured if you put some distinct feature that the other cards don't have, that would be your starting point. So in this case, I did an orange rectangular box around it. So I ended up actually taking the button sprite. So if we go back into the sprite's costumes, I'm going to click things. And if I scroll down, let's see if this is going to scroll. Oops, too far. It was button 3, which is right here, button 3A, is what I ended up using. Actually, it was button 3B. The sprite was button 3, but the costume that most of the ones that I used ended up being button 3B. The little footprints that you see on each of my cards, which I'm going to zoom in, I actually Googled clip art for footprints, and if the background is kind of like this checkered pattern, which actually I will show you. So let's go here. And let's see, I Googled, I think it was footsteps clip art. And that brought me here. So I ended up using this one here. So if you click on it, you can see that there's this gray and white checkered pattern behind it, which I find works the best with importing it into Scratch, where you can still use you're not getting like the background around it, so you're not getting like the white that you would get, let's say, on this one. So I usually look for different clip arts that go with this. So, but one of the unfortunate problems with doing it is that you can't always change, let's say, the color of the imported clip art, whereas if it's a sprite that's originally in the game, the program, you can manipulate it a little bit more. So I put the footprints in there, and I kind of grouped it together to make it sort of like a stepping pattern, and then I ended up putting it on the card so that it matches with the first backdrop that I had here. So I just took one of the, actually if I click on it, no, that's, it's grouped together. I put two footprints together, and I put those on the cards. So I also took the button and changed the colors. So I took the white here, and I'm pretty sure I took this gray color. And when I use the fill bucket tool here, use the different gradient options, and I created the same effect that the original button had for the costume. The blue I ended up keeping the same. So each of my cards here have 4 costumes. They have the answer for level 1, the answer for level 2, and the question for level 1 and the question for level 2. So each of the costumes has a different number and for the answers, so they don't necessarily have to be the same. And on each of the question cards, if I zoom in here, you can see that I put a letter and the equation that the students are going to have to solve. So in order for the rules that my game has, the students have to solve the equation, and they will get one of the answers that ends up being on this card here. They will then be able to click the card, and it will give them a new equation with a new letter. So if you keep the letters in order as you solve the equations, it will answer the riddle at the end of the level. So the students have to be very careful in what they're doing. I looked up different equations, found the answers to come up with a specific order and pattern for these equations that you see here. So I'm going to go through the coding now. Oh, also with these card sprites that are here with the different footprints and the two answer cards, I ended up actually creating the codes for each of these cards once, and I ended up duplicating the sprite so that the code would still be within the specific sprite, and ended up changing all the numbers and the letters and equations in each of the costumes for these, just to make it easier for me to use. Another way to do it, because I have all of the costumes here ready, would be to just copy the codes over, which aren't difficult to do. Okay, so if I'm going to go to the scripts to go over a few of the codes that I had in my game. Okay, so I usually like to start with the codes for the backdrops, and I actually use a lot of broadcast blocks to help keep the different layers of the game that I'm creating so that they don't malfunction and interact with each other in the wrong way. So I usually start with that when the green flag is clicked, I'm going to go to the costumes, and I'm going to switch the backdrop to start. So when the green flag is clicked, I want my first backdrop to be the start. That's just my main page, and I like where that's starting. The next thing that I like to do a lot of is these broadcasting messages here. So I'm going to have a few different ones. So I'm going to input a new message, and I'm going to have it say level 1. Okay, and when the script receives level 1, I want the backdrop, so I'm just going to duplicate this block and change it into level 1. So when level 1 is broadcasted, it's going to receive level 1, and as you can see, the backdrop here turned to level 1. I'm going to duplicate this whole thing, and I'm going to switch this to become a new message, and I'm going to make it level 2. Press OK. And when level 2 is broadcasted, I want my backdrop to switch to level 2. So if I click this to activate it, it's going to switch to level 2, as you can see over here. Okay, I'm going to duplicate this again because I have a few different levels to this game. I'm going to then switch it so that when I'm going to change a new message. So I'm going to do, yeah, for this one. When I receive, I'm going to do win. Okay, so when I receive win, I'm going to have this switch to winner. So if I click this to activate it, you can see that it has all the balloons that are over here. Okay, I also want it to play a sound when you win, because it's always fun when there's extra sounds added to it. So if I go to the sounds, okay, so it looks like the sounds didn't copy over when I was doing this, which is easy for this one because I actually took it from here. So if I go to the sound library, and I think it's Dance Celebration is the name of the one that I used. Here we go, Dance Celebration. So I'm going to press OK. And if you play, this will...
Hey!
Okay, I always think that sound is kind of fun, and I don't need the pop, so I'm just going to get rid of that. So if we go back to the scripts, actually, I also want this to play a sound. So I'm going to go to sound, and when it switches to winner, I want it to play the dance celebration sound. There's also a few features that I wanted to put that when you finish the game, you can go back to the beginning and restart the game. So I am going to actually have another one of these when I receive, and I'm going to do a different code for this, a different message, which I'm going to make it start. So this is going to be the new beginning of my game, so I'm just going to kind of have a loop for my game, so you just can keep playing it over and over again. And I'm going to switch this so that it goes to start. I also want the backdrop to switch when I figure out what the directions are and the rules. So I'm going to duplicate this and change, give it another message of play. So when I receive play, I want to go to the how to play backdrop. So if I click this, you can kind of see that the rules are back here. So this was all the code that I had just for looking at the different backdrops. I wanted to add riddles to my game, so once the students solve all the problems, they have to answer a riddle. So I couldn't put the riddle in each one of these sprites, so I added them to the codes of the backdrop here. So I'm going to start with I'm going to start with this. When the backdrop is at level 1, I'm going to start with a forever loop. And then I'm going to ask a question. So I'm going to ask a question here. So the question that I'm going to ask would be for my riddle. So my riddle is going to be the more you take, the more you leave behind. What are they? Okay, so that's my question for my riddle. But now I need to be able to have a way to answer the question. So I'm going to add an if-then loop inside my forever loop. And I'm going to have it broadcast level 2. So when this question is answered, which I'm going to put in between this if-then, it's going to broadcast level 2, which will bring you to the next level. But because there is a forever here, after I broadcast level 2, I want it to stop this script. Yeah, I'm going to stop this script. Okay, so now I'm going to put what my answer is going to be in here. So I'm going to need this little answer block, and I'm going to have to use the ORs in here because I want to give a few different options, because if you don't do that, you're gonna have to type in the answer very specifically to what you write in here. So by using these ORs, which I'm just going to add a few different options of wording this, you can make the answer more natural, when you're writing things. But I think that's too many. Okay, so then I'm going to have a few of these to say what your answers could be. So, actually I need more answers. Okay, so if you put the answers in here, you're going to say that the answer needs to equal something, whichever you need the answers. So, the answer to this riddle happens to be footprints. So I wanted to write a few different ways that you can write this. So I'm going to write it with some lowercase, where it's just footprints. But then somebody could write it with an uppercase. So I wanted to write with footprints with an uppercase F. Okay, and another option is, well, what if you have your cap lock on? So I'm going to write it in all caps. And by doing this now, it doesn't have to be as exact when you're typing in the answer for the riddle. So I'm just going to stick these little equals into my ors. So it's saying that it doesn't have to be every single one of these, but it can be one of them, and then it'll work. Okay, so this is my riddle question and my possible answer script for level 1. So I'm just going to duplicate this, and just by changing this to level 2, now this is the riddle question for level 2. So you can put a new question in here where it says ask the question, and then you can put new answers in order just to save time, because there's a lot of aspects to this game. I'm just going to leave it the way it is. But now it's also going to broadcast win. So when it broadcasts win, as you can see up here, now it's going to go to the celebration backdrop and music. So this is what I did for the codes for each of my backdrops, and it's just one by itself. And the different backdrops are kind of like costumes. Okay, so now I'm going to look at some of the buttons that I did. So I'm going to start with the start button, which seems like a good place to start. So I'm going to start with when the green flag is clicked. I want to show this button because you want to be able to see it. And then I don't want it to just be at any random place, so I'm going to give it a specific place to go when it's clicked. So I'm going to do -11 for my X value, and for my Y value, I'm going to do a -42. So when the green flag is clicked, as you can see, I'm in that start background, and my start button is right here. But it doesn't really do anything right now. It's just a random sprite. So because I have the different levels and backdrops in my game, I'm going to have to show it or hide it in certain backdrops. So if I go to events, I'm going to do when I receive level 1, I am going to hide it. I don't really need a start button when I'm at level 1, so I'm just going to hide. I'm going to duplicate this a few times and switch this to level 2 because I don't need the start button at level 2. I'm going to duplicate it again because I don't need this at the win. And I'm going to duplicate this one more time, but I'm going to put it at play. But when I'm at play, that's my instructions. I want to be able to still play my game. So I'm going to get rid of the high, and I'm going to put a show. but I don't necessarily want it in the same spot, so I'm going to go to the motion and have a go to in a specific location on my board. So I'm going to do, let's see, I'm going to do 0 and negative 150. Just because then it's out of the way of my rules for when you receive play. So it's down here. So if we were at our, let's see, our play, which has our rules here, you can see that the start button is down here and it's not in the way of the rules. So let's go back to the start button so we can finish the different scripts for this one. Okay, so there's a few more things that I have to do with this. We have to say when our sprite is clicked, what is going to happen. So let's see. I added this button sound, so I ended up finding a sound online, and I just downloaded it and imported it in here where I can still manipulate it. So it's easy to just find free sound effects in there to add to your game. So here I have a button sound that I like, which sounds like, it's a little charming. It sounds kind of like, you know, an elevator a little bit, but kind of like your phone or a device. So that's the sound that I picked. So in this script, I'm going to play the button sound when it's clicked. But then I'm also going to hide it because I'm not going to need it after it's clicked. I'm also going to broadcast level 1. So when the start button is clicked, I'm going to go to level 1. As you can see, it brings me to the level 1 backdrop that I had, as well as my riddle now shows up at the bottom of the screen. So that was how I just started my game. If you, let's say you're not reading the rules and you're just going, okay, the game is going to start. So now let's go to the how to play button. Okay, so for this button, I have to show up when it's going to start. So when the green flag is clicked, I am going to show this button, and I'm going to go to a specific location because I don't want it to just be wherever I left it last. So I'm going to make this -7 and -95. So if I click this, it's going to show right here, which I think my start button was about here, so it works out. So similar to the start button, I'm going to have when I receive level 1, I am going to hide. Okay, and I'm going to duplicate this and have the same thing for level 2, as well as for when you receive win and when you receive play. Okay, so this button doesn't really show up a lot, but there is another time when I do want it to show. So I'm going to duplicate this, and when I receive start, I want this to show up. And this is for the loop that I created for the replay button, which we'll get to next. So that way the game will just continue to go through, and you can go through the scavenger hunt a few times. So now we have to say what's going to happen when we click the sprite. Because it's a button, it's got to be clicked. So when this sprite is clicked, I'm going to play the button sound. So I always think it's fun to add little sounds to the games. And then I'm going to hide this button, and I'm going to broadcast play. So when the sprite is clicked, so I can click this button here, it's going to make the button sound, which you can hear, and it's going to go to this how to play backdrop, which has the games. My start button is actually where my riddle is, so I can't click it at the moment. But if we were to, let's say, start from the beginning, and let's move this little block, then if I press how to play, I have my rules, then I can click start, and as you can see now the riddle comes up and I'm at level 1. So now I have to deal with the tiles, but actually first I'm going to do the replay button. So the replay button is very similar to the other buttons on this game. So when the green flag is clicked, I'm not going to need the replay button, so I'm going to hide it when it first starts, because there's no need for me to have it. Then I'm going to do when I receive the other messages. So I'm going to duplicate this hide because I'm not going to need it for level 1 as well as for level 2. I'm going to duplicate this again, and I'm not going to need it for when I have the rules, and I'm not going to need it when I'm at start. So these are the places where I'm not going to need this button. Where I am going to need this button is when I'm at the winner's backdrop. So I'm going to duplicate this, get rid of the hide, and I'm going to go to looks, and I'm going to get the show. So I'm going to show this when I receive win. And I'm going to pick a specific location somewhere on this board here where it's going to go. Because again, I don't want it to float around. So I'm going to give the location at 169 for my X value and a negative 148 for my Y value. So if I click this, I actually think it's behind here, so you won't be able to see it until you get to the winner's page. So now we have to say what happens when we click this specific button. So when this sprite is clicked, we are going to actually first start off with stopping all sounds. So the winner sound that plays when you get to the winner's page at the end with the balloons is a little bit of a longer sound. So if you just want to play all over again and skip through it, then you're going to have to, the sound will continue to play after that. So I want to stop all sounds first. But then when it's clicked, I want the button sound to be played because then it's your button and you're clicking it. Then I want it to hide. So I'm just going to duplicate the little block from one of my other spots. And then I want it to broadcast start. So this is where the loop continues. So the first time you're going through everything, it's starting with the when the green flag is clicked, and it goes through all the scripts with that. By adding this broadcast start, it can go back to the beginning of the loop without needing to have this green flag clicked by adding this broadcast start, which I end up using a lot in Scratch, which I find is very helpful. Okay, so those are all the buttons that I created for my game. So now we're just going to look at the different tiles. So The code for each of these tiles down here is actually identical, except for just the location that is within them, but that's easy to change, and you can put the blocks wherever you would like. So I'm just going to do the code for one of them and then just show how you duplicate them. If you, let's say, create the costumes or the sprites first. Okay, so I'm going to start with when the green flag is clicked. I am not going to need this sprite, so I'm going to hide it. Okay, so when I'm starting, I'm not going to need it. So let's say if I press the green flag here to start it over, as you can see, the sprite that was here is no longer there. So I'm just actually going to copy this into all of the other spots, just because then it makes it a little bit easier to see the beginning if all these other sprites are not in the way. So now if I press the green flag, yes, they're all on. So this is my start screen, where I have my start button, which goes to here, which I haven't written the code for everything else, so right now all the other tile cards are hiding. And then you can continue through the game. So also if we press the start again, we can go to the how to play, and as you can see here are the directions, and then if you click start, it brings you to level 1, and the riddle comes up here. Okay, so when I receive level 1, I want this sprite to show up and to switch to costume answer level 1. So the way this game works, you start off with all the answers, and then you when you click them, it gives you the equation and the letter. So the answer is not really like excuse me, is not really the normal answer where it's like the question and then the answer. It's the answer first in this case. Excuse me. Okay, so then also I don't want it to float around, so I'm going to give it a position to go. And when I was originally creating this game, I figured out all the positions that made them nice and even apart from each other. So I already know what numbers I'm putting in, but you can play with whichever numbers you would like for these. Excuse me. Okay, so now I have that. When I receive level 1, this is where my button is going to go. But right now it doesn't do anything, it's just there is my card. So for this, I'm actually going to duplicate this, because one, I want my costume to be in the same, my sprite to be in the same spot when I go to level 2. So when I receive level 2, it's going to go to the same position. But I want it to be in a different costume, and I want it to be in answer level 2. So if we go back to my costumes here, you can see that this is the answer for level 1, which is my starting point, and this is my answer for level 2. So the code is pretty similar going from level 1 to level 2 for my scripts. Okay, so now when each of these sprites are clicked, the code gets a little bit more complicated. So when this sprite is clicked, I'm going to start with an if then else block. There's a lot of logic and conditionals to this. I'm actually going to have this also in between each of these, because I have to have, first of all, you know, when the background is a certain way, it's going to do something. And also within each of them, I want it to be able to go back and forth between the two costumes in each level. So that way, if you do accidentally click the wrong card, you'll be able to see what the answer was originally, so you can find out the answer to the riddle. So I'm going to start off with, let's see, nope, into looks. And I'm going to take backdrop's name and costume number. I'm going to need actually 2 costume numbers. Okay, and I'm going to need some operations here. So I'm going to need this equal one 3 times. Okay, so when backdrop name is equal to level 1, so when my backdrop is level 1, is what I'm going to have for my larger conditional. So when the backdrop is level 1, I want it to switch between 2 of the costumes. So I want my costume number to be 1. So when I was first creating this, I had to figure out that this is actually costume number and not the name. So if you go back to this costume section, this little number right here tells you what the costume number is for each of these. So for level 1, I wanted to switch between costume 1 and costume 2. And for level 2, I wanted to switch between costume 3 and costume 4. So that comes into play. So I'm going to make this for costume 3. So when my backdrop is level 1, I'm going to be dealing with costumes 1 and 2. So if my costume is in the first costume, which is this one here, I want it to then switch my costume to question level 1. So by doing that, I click it, and it should switch to the one with the question and the letter. But I want it also to be able to go back. So once I click this, it's not going to do anything. So I have this else here, so that way I can go back to my original costume. So I'm going to switch this to answer level 1. So now if I click this, it keeps going back between the 2. And this is only for the level 1, because I'm dealing with the first part if my backdrop is in level 1. But if not, it's going to be in level 2. So that's where I'm going to be dealing with when my costume number is 3. So I'm going to have something similar where it's going to switch to question level 2 costume and then switch back to the answer level 2. So now when I go to level 2, let's say if I type in footprints was the answer to the riddle, so footprints, and I click enter. Now I'm on level 2 here, and as you can see I had a different card. So now if I click back and forth, I'm switching between costumes 3 and costumes 4 for level 2. And each of these tiles have different numbers, different questions to spell out the answers to the riddles. So the names of the costumes are all the same for each of the sprites. So by copying this code and putting it in each of these sprites, it will work for all of them. And I just like to add sound because I think it makes it a lot more fun. So in this one I created a whoosh sound, kind of like a card flipping sound, and this one was not in Scratch, so I had to go find a free download sound effect. So I have this sound here, so if I play it, it makes a whoosh, which I think sounds like a card flipping over. So now if I go back to the script up here, and I go to the sounds, I'm going to play the whoosh sound when the costume switches. So if I add it where all the costume switches in this code, and I'm just going to go back to the beginning real quick. If I press start, I have the first one here. So now if I click this, you can hear the whoosh sound every time I click this. So I think that's kind of fun, and it makes it more like a real game. Okay, so that was actually all the code that I created for my game. So this script here is copied into each of these, and you put different locations on each of these different tiles or playing cards for my game, so that they end up nice. So if I go to this tab here with my final project, this is the completed one where each of them have the code. So if I click any of these, they have the code that they're supposed to, but with their different locations here. So if I go to start, you can see that I have all of the tiles here, and all of them do make this fun sound, and they do go back to that. So the answer to this one was footprints. And then level 2, I have all different cards. Even though it's the same sprite, I found it easier to create only 10 of them instead of having 20 and just having them disappear. So this worked out easier. And then I did have a different riddle. So this riddle was, we see it once in a year, twice in a week, and never in a day. What is it? And it ends up being the letter E. So I did put different options for this one, so I am actually going to show you that there were more options in this one. So if I do go to the backdrops here, and I do look at this script, you can see that if I zoom out here, there were many more options for the possible answers for this one, which I wanted to put so that the students weren't going to have trouble putting in their answers for this one, because there are spaces when I typed it originally, and then there are some options where there are like all caps and no spaces, or lowercase and all spaces, just for students that just end up typing just the letters in as they are. So I can show you if I type in, if I type in the letter E, it's going to go to the winners page and make the music, which you can hear, which is kind of fun. And if I press replay, it'll go back, which I think sometimes it spazzes a little bit just because it's a larger file with different sprites and code and everything. So, but you can start again. If you press start, it will go through the whole game again. So this is a continuous game. So let's say if you just want more practice, or like if students want to do it for review when the test comes up, they can do the equations again. So it's really easy for them to replay it over and over again. So this is my final project. I hope you enjoyed.